Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Philadelphia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1891, and Philadelphia's air carried a chill sharper than the usual February dampness. A gray mist rolled low across Walnut Street, dimming the lamps even before midnight. The city, still proud of its medical schools and scientific clubs, prided itself on logic and progress. Yet behind closed doors of a narrow townhouse near Pine Street, that confidence was quietly eroding. The man at the center was Dr. Edgar Mallory, a physician trained in both anatomy and what he called psychical influence, a fashionable term borrowed from the lectures that trace back to Dr. Benjamin Rush, whose theories on the mind's elasticity had once electrified this same city. Mallory's patients said he could still a trembling hand or calm a restless mind with only his gaze. Others whispered that he could do much more. The first mention of him in the county ledger came from a land transfer signed in November of 1887. The property, a narrow three-story dwelling, had been the home of a retired cooper who sold it after his wife's sudden collapse at a church gathering. She had spoken of sleeplessness, of hearing her own name whispered just as she closed her eyes. The sale record notes Mallory's payment in cash, the ink dark and pressed hard, as though written with unease. Neighbors later said they rarely saw light from the doctor's windows, save for a single dim lamp flickering behind drawn curtains. At times visitors arrived, mostly young men and women, some well-dressed, some clearly poor, and left in silence, faces pale and eyes unfocused. A washerwoman named Clara Donnelly told a reporter years late, "It was as if they'd gone in with souls and come out empty." Her quote survives only in the brittle column of the Pennsylvania Evening Bulletin, dated April 1892. Mallory's reputation grew privately. The city's medical fraternity debated his methods in quiet tones. He was no fraud, they said, merely ahead of his time, an heir to the humane ideas Rush had once advanced, seeking to treat illness of thought rather than flesh. But something in Mallory's eyes, recorded by those who met him, seemed too steady, too knowing. The first disturbance came when one of his patients, a clerk named Simon Keene, was found wandering along the Delaware waterfront at dawn, coat torn and bareheaded. He could remember only fragments, a silver watch swinging, a voice telling him to sleep until it ends. He died within the week, fevered and incoherent, murmuring that someone had borrowed his will. The coroner, Dr. Silas Morcom, recorded the cause as exhaustion and mental collapse, though he added a quiet note in the margin, unusual ocular fixation marks. By March, gossip had turned to quiet alarm. 3 more patients vanished from Mallory's appointment register, their names carefully crossed out in identical ink. County constables made inquiries but found no formal complaints. The doctor, they said, had influence. His letters of recommendation bore the signatures of respected men, some of whom traced their lineage to Rush's old medical society. And so, for months, the case remained invisible, growing only in whispered fragments traded over late coffee and the hiss of street lamps. By early summer of 1891, the city's heat began to settle in, a damp, heavy warmth that made the brick walls sweat and the alleyways smell faintly of iron and rot. The townhouse on Pine Street appeared shuttered most days, though a faint hum was sometimes heard within, like a slow rhythmic tapping upon glass. A delivery boy named Francis Lyle later testified he'd seen the doctor through the open door one afternoon, standing perfectly still before a mirror, lips moving though no sound reached the street. The boy said it looked like a prayer, or perhaps a warning. Most dismissed it as imagination brought on by the heat. But in July, another record appeared in the coroner's file. A young seamstress named Lydia Hancombe, found dead in her rented room near Rittenhouse Square. No wounds, no poison, only a small bruise beneath her right eye. Her employer claimed she'd visited Dr. Mallory for treatment of fatigue and fainting spells. In her purse was a folded paper. The mind, once opened, may not close again. The handwriting, though unproven, matched samples from Mallory's notes preserved years later. The local papers ran cautious headlines. Mystery death baffles, physicians and society girls passing stirs questions. Yet, without evidence of wrongdoing, the constables could do little. Mallory was interviewed once, calmly explaining his theories on suggestion and rest cures. He spoke of the mind as a field of delicate instruments easily misaligned, words almost echoing Rush's century-old writings on the human psyche's frailty. The medical and surgical reporter published a short notice defending his methods, calling them an attempt to humanize hysteria. Still, some readers found the phrasing eerie, too gentle for a man so often linked to the vanished. By August, strange correspondences began circulating among Philadelphia's physicians. Envelopes with no return address contained brief, 1C. Eigned notes warning, do not look into his eyes. One such letter reached Dr. Horace Fennell, a lecturer at Jefferson Medical College, who quietly passed it to the city marshal. The handwriting appeared feminine, uneven, possibly written in haste. No one claimed it. The marshal's report, later recovered from courthouse debris after a fire in 1904, lists it under miscellaneous communications, filed and forgotten. Residents along Pine Street told similar stories as the summer waned, that the doctor now took only night appointments, his visitors guided by a flickering lamp hung just above the doorway. Some said they heard voices from the cellar, others the sound of dragging feet followed by silence. A servant girl, interviewed decades later, remembered carrying coal to the basement and seeing what she described as a narrow cot with leather straps and a silver watch ticking over it, like a pendulum that never stopped. Her words, recorded in a 1910 folklore study at the University of Pennsylvania, were dismissed as embellishment. Yet within weeks, Mallory himself seemed to retreat from public view. The local chemist, who once supplied him with ether and laudanum, reported his last purchase that September. Chloroform, 3 ounces for laboratory use. After that, the doctor's name ceased appearing in professional directories. The Pine Street property taxes went unpaid, and by October a notice was posted on his door, vacate or forfeit. It was then, neighbors said, that the light finally went out in the window, the one that had glowed for 4 years without fail. When the authorities finally entered the townhouse that autumn, it was less a raid than an inspection. A clerk from the tax office accompanied by 2 patrolmen from the 9th Precinct. Their official purpose was to serve a repossession notice, but the first man to cross the threshold later said the air inside smelled of burned paper and iron. Dust lay thick across the furniture, yet on the desk near the window sat a single unlit candle, fresh and unused. Behind it hung a long mirror framed in black walnut, its surface so clouded that only faint shapes could be seen. The patrolman, a veteran named James Croft, remarked that he could swear he saw movement within it, though none of them had stirred. The rooms upstairs were bare, no clothing, no linens, only a small trunk containing medical instruments wrapped in flannel. Some were ordinary scalpels and probes, others more obscure, thin rods tipped with polished glass, a pair of silver discs mounted on wire handles, and a small notebook filled with handwriting so tight it resembled stitching. The entries were undated, but several lines stood out. Subject 7 resists the command to forget, and later, a trembling begins when conscience awakens. One page bore a faint reddish smear, as though pressed by a thumb still wet. In the cellar, the light from their lanterns revealed what appeared to be a rough workroom. The floor had been scraped clean, except for a rectangular patch of darker soil in the far corner. When the officers prodded it with a shovel, the earth sank easily, giving off a scent of damp clay. Beneath, they found fragments of cloth, a broken pair of spectacles, and the corner of a wooden case roughly the size of a child's coffin. The box was empty, its interior lined with mirrors on every side. The inventory list, written by Clerk Thomas Greer, simply described it as reflective chamber, purpose unknown. No human remains were recorded, but Croft's report mentioned that the walls bore faint markings, like concentric circles drawn in chalk. Among them, a phrase half erased: "The reflection learns the gaze." The file was sent to the coroner's office, though Dr. Morcom, still overseeing inquiries, found nothing conclusive. He compared Mallory's devices to those described by earlier psychologists and mesmerists, referencing once again the legacy of Dr. Benjamin Rush, how his theories on the mind's balance between sanity and delusion had inspired generations, sometimes dangerously so. By late November, the case had grown too strange for official pursuit. The police sealed the property, and for a time it stood silent, a narrow house adrift in the city's constant noise. But curiosity lingered. Students from the nearby medical college dared each other to peek through the boarded windows. One of them, writing in his diary years later, claimed that inside, the mirror by the window had somehow remained spotless amid the dust, as though someone still stood before it each night. Through winter, small reports surfaced of a man matching Mallory's description, seen near the Schuylkill River, walking with an uneven gait, one gloved hand carrying a satchel. He was never stopped, and by spring the sighting ceased altogether. The ledger closed with the note, "Presumed absconded," signed in fading ink by Marshall Dent. Even so, Philadelphia's quieter circles continued to speak of him, not as a killer or charlatan, but as a man who had strayed too far into the machinery of thought, where science began to resemble sorcery. The Pine Street house, unclaimed, soon drew its own mythology. Locals said its mirrors clouded on humid nights, as if remembering what they had once seen. By the spring of 1892, the Pine Street property had fallen into possession of the city. Officials debated whether to auction it or demolish the structure outright. The surrounding neighbors pressed for removal, claiming the stench from the basement lingered even after lime-washing crews had passed through. 2 laborers hired to clear the remaining debris quit after a single day, refusing to re-enter. They told a foreman that while sweeping dust from the cellar, they heard a faint knocking, rhythmic and patient, as though from behind one of the walls. When the foreman checked later that evening, he found nothing but the outline of the bricked alcove where the mirror-lined case had been unearthed. He sealed it again with mortar, marking the date in chalk, April 12, 1892. At that same time, another thread began to emerge. A series of letters surfaced in a second-hand bookshop on Spruce Street, bound together by a faded ribbon. The shopkeeper, a widower named Samuel Rote, said the packet had been sold to him by a thin, nervous woman who refused to give her name. The letters bore Mallory's handwriting. The earliest were dated 1888 and addressed to a Dr. Horace Fennell, the same man who had received the anonymous warning months earlier. The correspondence started as academic, discussions of trance, suggestion, and the supposed mirror of identity through which memory could be altered. But by the final letter, Mallory's tone had shifted to confession. The reflection answers now before the subject speaks. I have lost the boundary between witness and participant. Rote turned the packet over to the constabulary, but no charges followed. The letters were quietly stored with other unclaimed documents, later destroyed when the courthouse archives burned in 1904. Only one transcription survived in the private notes of a journalist, Margaret Ellison, who had covered the original inquest. She describes Ibid Mallory's handwriting as steady, deliberate, unrepentant, and noted that he often switched between first and third person as if documenting someone else's thoughts. During those same months, stories spread of new patients coming forward, people who claimed to have been treated by Mallory long before his disappearance. One, a music teacher named Charles Benton, testified that during a session in 1889, the doctor had made him stare into a silver watch while murmuring phrases he could never afterward recall. He said that for weeks afterward, he dreamed of his own reflection, turning away from him, refusing to follow his movements. Another, a domestic servant, told her employer that the doctor's office contained not one mirror, but 7, each covered by a cloth when not in use. By June, Philadelphia's newspapers had grown weary of the case, calling it an embarrassment to modern medicine. Still, a quiet fascination endured in the academic community. Some claimed Mallory had discovered a form of deep hypnotic dissociation decades before such terms existed. Others suspected delusion, perhaps encouraged by the city's long obsession with mesmerism since Rush's time. The truth remained buried among fragmentary testimonies and fading ink, like the doctor himself, half believed, half erased. That summer, the property on Pine Street was finally auctioned. A traveling bookseller purchased it for a fraction of its value, intending to convert it into storage. But when he attempted renovations, his carpenter reported that each morning the mirror in the front room stood uncovered, though no one claimed to have touched it. The carpenter sealed the door and refused further work, noting in his journal, "There are houses that remember too much." By autumn of 1892, the new owner, Mr. Albert Tress, had taken possession of the Pine Street house. He was a practical man, not easily frightened, and dismissed the building's reputation as mere superstition. He cleared the cellar, installed new shelving, and even rented the upper floors to a pair of young stenographers from the insurance bureau. For several months, life returned to the narrow townhouse. The lamp glowed again in the front window, and neighbors began to relax. Yet by November, small disturbances crept back. One of the tenants, Miss Clara Hewitt, complained that she could not sleep because of whispering that came from the mirror. She said the sound was faint, like breathing through glass. Her roommate, skeptical, claimed it was only drafts in the old chimney. But on the morning of November 27th, Clara failed to arrive at her office. Her bed was found empty, her belongings undisturbed, and the mirror in the sitting room had fallen from the wall. Its surface cracked in a perfect circle, as though struck from within. The landlord filed a report, and constables searched the premises, but found no trace of her. In the official record, her name appears in faded ink under Missing Persons, 1892, annotated with 2 words, "No leads." Tress closed the property once more, this time boarding the windows himself. He sold the mirror to an antiquarian dealer named Hiram Lowes, whose shop stood near the docks. Within weeks, Lowes claimed the glass drew customers unbidden. People who entered, stared for a moment, and left without speaking. He sold the piece to a collector in Baltimore and never mentioned it again. 2 years later, his shop burned to the ground during a thunderstorm, and the surviving papers list no cause. In early 1893, a visiting professor from the University of Pennsylvania's medical department, Dr. Edwin Crozer, delivered a lecture on experimental hypnotic states and the risks of prolonged suggestion. He cited, without naming Mallory, a Philadelphia practitioner who attempted to divide conscience from recollection. The paper, though brief, warned that certain minds, when opened, may never close again. His audience received it politely, if uneasily, and afterward he was approached by a man claiming to have known the doctor personally. The man's name was never recorded, but Crozer later wrote in a private note, "He spoke as though Mallory were still at work, only elsewhere." That same spring, the Pine Street property changed hands again, this time to a church mission intending to use it as a convalescent home. Workers began clearing the basement, uncovering remnants of the mirror frames Mallory had once installed. 7 niches, precisely measured, the plaster still bearing faint circular impressions. In one corner, they found a wooden board etched with the same phrase the constables had noted years earlier. "The reflection learns the gaze." The mission withdrew from the purchase within the week. Through all this, the newspapers had long turned their attention elsewhere. Yet among the city's older families, the name Mallory remained a quiet cautionary tale of science trespassing into faith and of mirrors that kept memories better than the living. Benjamin Rush's early experiments, once hailed as progress, were whispered now as precedent, an unfinished chapter that had inspired the doctor who stared too long into his own work. By 1894, Philadelphia was trying to forget. The fairgrounds and factories drew attention back to progress, to invention and light, but the older quarters of the city still carried their quiet rot. On Pine Street, the Mallory house stood shuttered, its door warped from rain, a faint line of soot marking the lintel. Yet men still passed it with caution. Teamsters crossing late at night claimed to hear a faint ticking from within, like the steady beat of a watch. One said he'd seen a figure standing by the window, no lamp, no glow, just the outline of a man staring into the street as though waiting for something that never came. In March of that year, the medical board received a parcel with no return address. Inside were several small glass slides, the sort used for microscope work, and a single note written on linen paper. The pulse may be stopped, but not the thought. The handwriting bore an uncanny resemblance to Mallory's, though faded, as if written years earlier. A clerk filed the materials under miscellaneous, but later that month, the entire drawer went missing. Only the inventory card survived, bearing one initial at the bottom, E.M. A few months later, a new rumor began circulating among the city's hospitals. A patient at St. Agnes Infirmary had fallen into an unresponsive trance, muttering the same words over and over. Nurses said his eyes never blinked, and when they attempted to move him, he whispered, "He calls through glass." The man was a dock worker, no known connection to Mallory, but his case drew the attention of Dr. Horace Fennell, the very physician who'd once corresponded with the missing doctor. Fennell visited the ward, observed the patient, and reportedly left pale and silent. He made no public statement, though a marginal note in his personal journal, later transcribed by his nephew, reads, "If he lives, we must never let him see a mirror." While a local reporter named Margaret Ellison, who had covered the original inquest, revisited the story for a retrospective column. She described revisiting Pine Street in early autumn, finding the house locked but the shutters loose. Through a crack, she saw what she called a shimmer, like a faint breath on glass. Her editor refused to print the piece, calling it too much like folklore, but she kept her notes, later donating them to a private collection. Among her observations was one striking line: "The silence of that place feels watched." As the year turned, a fire broke out 2 blocks east, consuming several older homes. The flames stopped at Pine Street, leaving the Mallory property untouched. Firemen later remarked that smoke had entered the house through every seam, yet none of the interior wood was scorched. They said the mirrors, though boarded, were the only objects left, reflecting the flicker of the blaze. One of them swore the boards vibrated as if struck from within. By the end of 1894, the house had been condemned by order of the city inspector, but the file, which should have closed the matter, bore an odd addendum in pencil. "Property remains observed. Avoid entry after dusk." No further comment, no signature, and no one could later say who had written it. By the beginning of 1895, the condemned house had become a fixture of local cautionary tales. Children dared one another to touch its front step, and peddlers avoided passing too near after dark. The structure's windows were sealed with boards, yet now and again passers-by swore they caught a glint between the slats, a momentary reflection, like a single eye opening. Municipal workers sent to finalize the demolition order delayed their visit several times, citing illness and poor weather. In one internal note, the foreman wrote simply, "Men refuse to enter. House unsettles them." In February, a historian from the Pennsylvania Historical Society, named Elias Morton, decided to document the property before its destruction. Morton was meticulous, known for collecting obscure medical pamphlets and forgotten manuscripts. He entered with 2 assistants and spent nearly 4 hours cataloging the interior. His surviving notes, later recovered from his archive, describe rooms stripped bare, but curiously clean, as though freshly wiped by unseen hands. On the 2nd floor, they found a small study with one object intact, a portrait photograph in an oval frame showing Dr. Edgar Mallory seated at his desk. The glass was cracked across his face, and behind his image, faintly visible through the damage, was another blurred figure standing over his shoulder. Morton concluded his entry that day with the line, "The exposure appears double, though the shadows disagree." 2 weeks later, Morton collapsed at his home while editing his field notes. Witnesses said he had been staring into a small hand mirror moments before, murmuring to himself. He never recovered. The coroner recorded cerebral exhaustion, though the attending physician added, "Pupils unresponsive, fixed as if to a light unseen." The city quietly postponed demolition. Around that time, Margaret Ellison still following the case. The official demolition never resumed. Instead, The Pine Street property stood another winter, boarded, but breathing in that strange way that empty houses sometimes do. By January of 1896, it had become the subject of an informal investigation by two graduate students from the University of Pennsylvania's fledgling Department of Experimental Psychology. Their names, Arthur Penrose and Milton Dare, appear briefly in an academic circular of that year, referencing field observations of post-hypnotic environments. According to their notes, they entered the property under special permission from a city clerk who believed in rational documentation before disposal. What they recorded would later vanish from university archives, though a partial transcript surfaced decades later among Penrose's private effects. They described the interior as unnaturally still. Dust hung unmoving, though windows stood ajar. In the parlor they found the floorboards darkened in a perfect rectangle, like a shadow left by furniture long removed. Dare noted that when he placed his lantern over it, the light appeared to bend, softly, as though drawn into the wood. In the adjoining room stood a mirror, smaller than the one seen by constables years earlier, its surface mottled but still reflective. Penrose wrote that when he looked into it, he saw not his own outline, but the dim suggestion of another man behind him, indistinct, wearing what seemed a physician's coat. They left the house before sunrise, shaken but composed. Days later, Dare began exhibiting nervous symptoms, sleeplessness, tremors, sudden lapses in attention. Within weeks he withdrew from the program and later disappeared from the city entirely. Penrose continued teaching for several years, but would never again publish his field work. His last lecture, recorded by a student, ended with the words, "Mirrors hold more than reflection, the hill. They remember who watched first." By mid-year, ownership of the property transferred quietly to the city treasury, which fenced it off and labeled it unsafe. The address no longer appeared on municipal maps by the decade's end. When the census was taken in 1900, Pine Street listed a gap between numbers, an empty space where a house should have been. Yet several residents swore they could still see the structure, pale and windowless, standing just beyond the gaslight's reach. The folklore surrounding Dr. Mallory deepened. Some claimed he had fled to Canada. Others believed he'd perished in one of the city's warehouse fires, mistaken for a vagrant. But there were occasional reports, letters to newspapers, unsigned, describing encounters with a man fitting his description, gaunt, well-spoken, carrying a small satchel and an old silver watch that never seemed to stop ticking. Each letter ended with the same phrase, "His eyes are the same, but he looks through you now." Philadelphia's medical community, embarrassed by the persistence of the story, avoided comment. The legacy of Benjamin Rush was once more invoked. How his early faith in humane treatment had devolved in the hands of zealots, and how the city that birthed modern psychiatry could also nurture its ghosts. By 1897, the Mallory affair had faded from most official memory, yet remained stubbornly alive in rumor. The city's younger physicians treated it as cautionary myth, a warning against untested science. But among older residents of the district, the story persisted with small, unsettling details that never found print. A lamplighter named Jonas Fry claimed that on windless nights, the air near the old address smelled faintly of ether and wet iron. He said he once saw faint light glimmer through the cracks of the boarded door, steady as a breath. When questioned, he admitted he might have imagined it, but would not pass that way again after dark. In late February, an archivist named Miriam Cole discovered a sealed envelope misfiled among the medical board's correspondence. Inside were 5 small pages in Mallory's hand, notes of a lecture never delivered. The heading read, "The Removal of Remorse by Visual Suggestion." Beneath it were clinical observations, descriptions of subjects entering deep trance, their eyes fixed upon a reflective surface until recognition faltered. One sentence had been underlined twice. To cure guilt, one must first erase its witness. Cole brought the notes to her superior, who ordered them sealed and filed under restricted medical miscellany. The envelope was last seen in 1901, when the category itself was removed. That summer, a group of children exploring the alley behind Pine Street reported finding pieces of broken glass arranged in a circle, their edges blackened as if scorched. They claimed when sunlight struck the fragments, each shard reflected not the sky, but the shadow of a man leaning close. Adults dismissed it as fancy, yet by evening, the fragments had vanished. A week later, a constable assigned to patrol the area noted in his ledger, "Uneasy sound from vacant lot, like ticking or distant breath." No follow-up was recorded. Meanwhile, Margaret Ellison, the journalist who had long followed the story, returned once more to her files. She began drafting a book she intended to title The Hypnosis Murders, a Philadelphia Inquiry. Her outline suggested she hoped to connect Mallory's methods with the broader mesmerist movements of the century's end, citing cases across Europe and New England. She again mentioned Benjamin Rush, tracing the physician's early optimism for mental reform to what she called its darker inheritors. But her manuscript was never completed. In December of that year, she left for Maine to care for an ailing relative and disappeared from public record after 1899. A postcard found among her effects, mailed but undelivered, bore no message, only a drawing of an eye, carefully inked, staring through concentric circles. By the turn of the century, few in Philadelphia remembered Mallory by name, yet his legend had settled into the city's undercurrent like dust that refuses to wash away. Boarding houses told stories of mirrors that clouded when lies were spoken. Students whispered of a doctor who could walk through reflection and steal memory itself. Even the pragmatic police clerk who'd once filed the case confessed years later that whenever he passed a mirror at night, he looked away first. By 1898, Philadelphia had entered its modern age of electric street lamps and elevated trolleys, yet a few of its older blocks seemed untouched by light. Pine Street remained one of them. The empty lot where Mallory's townhouse once stood had been paved over, then fenced and forgotten, but residents swore that at certain angles, when the evening fog rolled in from the river, they could still glimpse the faint outline of the upper windows, a phantom geometry of vanished rooms. Those who walked that way after sundown often crossed to the other side, muttering about the cold spot. In May, a traveling lecturer named Dr. Alaric North visited the city to present a demonstration on hypnotism and suggestion. His audience was skeptical until he claimed descent from one of Philadelphia's lost physicians who pursued the moral anatomy of guilt. Several older doctors recognized the phrasing. It echoed Mallory's own writings from the surviving letters. North's performance was ordinary enough until the final act, when a volunteer collapsed mid-trance, whispering that he saw a face inside his own. The event was hastily concluded, and North left town that same night, leaving behind a small leather case containing instruments identical to those found in Mallory's basement years before. The university briefly examined the set before returning it to storage, where it quietly disappeared. Around the same time, a small fire broke out in the record room of the 9th Precinct. No lives were lost, but the shelves holding late 1880s medical inquiries were reduced to ash. Only one file survived, the Mallory report, singed at the edges but intact. The clerk who retrieved it later told a colleague that the folder felt warm, like something alive had been resting on it. His account was never included in the official summary. By autumn, city planners began leveling parts of the district to make way for new housing. Workmen clearing rubble from the Pine Street lot uncovered a series of stones arranged in a spiral, each marked with soot-dark circles, as though something had burned there repeatedly. Beneath one stone lay a rusted watch, its glass shattered but its hands frozen at precisely 12:04. The foreman kept it briefly before passing it to a pawnshop near Market Street. Within a week, he was found wandering along the riverbank, dazed, unable to recall his own name for several hours. When questioned later, he said he remembered a voice behind glass asking what time it was. Despite such reports, the city pushed forward with its redevelopment plans. By year's end, a new row of houses stood on the site, clean and modern, but tenants in the central unit complained that mirrors fogged without reason, and that their children sometimes spoke to their reflections as if to unseen playmates. One resident claimed his newborn's cradle rocked on its own when moonlight struck the parlor window. The landlord dismissed such talk, yet by 1900, 4 families had moved out without notice. The address no longer bore Mallory's name, yet his shadow lingered, diffuse, unprovable, and quietly unending. The city might have erased the walls, but not the memory of what had once stood there, nor the sense that somewhere between light and reflection, the doctor still watched his work continue. By 1901, the city directories listed Pine Street's new residents without remark, yet those who lived closest still avoided its center block. The new homes were soundly built, their gaslight fixtures replaced by electricity, but tenants spoke of odd flickers, brief dimmings that coincided with the strike of the hour. A clerk named George Atwell wrote to his sister that every night at precisely 12 minutes past 12, the light in my front room fades, and my face in the mirror seems older by a year. He moved out by spring. That same season, a local antiquarian society held a lecture series on American hypnotic practices of the 19th century. The first speaker, Professor Lyman Price, cited the notorious Philadelphia experiments of an unnamed physician who attempted to separate the moral and perceptive faculties of the brain. His summary echoed the phrasing once used by Benjamin Rush when discussing the dual nature of the human will. Price warned that such studies often blurred ethics with exhibition, and that the physician who stares too long into his subject's reflection may end by treating himself. The audience laughed politely, but afterward several members asked him privately whether he had seen the original Pine Street files. He told them he had, though they had since been withdrawn for preservation. No record exists of where they went. In August, a retired watchmaker named Elias Dorr, newly arrived from Baltimore, rented one of the newer houses on the site. He was unaware of its history. Neighbors later recalled his habit of working late by lamplight, polishing old pocket watches. He owned dozens, and the sound of their ticking could be heard faintly through the thin walls. One evening, the noise ceased all at once. When a neighbor knocked to check on him, Dorr answered the door pale and trembling, saying, "They all stopped together, every one." He died 2 nights later of heart failure, though his assistant swore the watches resumed ticking at the moment he passed. Among his effects, police found a single note scrawled on brown paper. He wanted to know the time. The local papers mentioned none of it. By then, the city was consumed with industry, with trolleys, telegraphs, and steel. Ghost stories were for children and drunks. Yet the tale persisted quietly in church basements and back rooms, of a doctor whose gaze could unfasten memory, of mirrors that breathed, of a house that could not quite be buried. In 1903, a visiting photographer attempting to document old Philadelphia reported that one of his plates developed incorrectly. Instead of the expected row of new homes, the image showed an older facade, narrow, dark-windowed, and unmistakably 19th century in style. When he returned to retake the shot, the building was not there. He destroyed the negative, but later told an associate that faint on the glass he could still read a number etched in the corner. 1891. By then, the story of Dr. Edgar Mallory had drifted beyond the reach of science or record. It belonged to whispers and sleeplessness, to the idea that reflection, once awakened, might never rest. And though the city had changed, those who passed the block still said they sometimes felt watched, not from behind, but from the faint gleam at the edge of every window pane. By 1904, Philadelphia's memory was again tested by fire. The courthouse blaze that spring devoured decades of civic records, the same disaster that had earlier erased the last surviving letters of Dr. Mallory. Among the ash-stained debris, a clerk salvaged a half-burned envelope marked simply Pine Street Inquiry. Inside lay fragments of transcriptions from witnesses long dead. One line survived whole. "If he is gone, why does his reflection remain?" The clerk, believing it a curiosity, carried it home as a souvenir. His family later reported that every mirror in their house cracked within a week. The event was dismissed as coincidence, but he was buried that autumn after a sudden stroke. The envelope was never found again. In the years that followed, the lot passed once more into neglect. The newer buildings aged poorly and tenants came and went. By 1905, the central unit was again vacant. City inspectors listed persistent dampness and mold. A plumber sent to check the foundations reported that his lantern dimmed each time he descended the stairs, though there were no drafts. He told his foreman that the air below felt occupied. His statement remains penciled in the margin of an otherwise mundane maintenance ledger. That same year, a psychology lecturer at the university, Professor Nathaniel Burke, revisited the Mallory affair in an academic essay titled Moral Trauma and Mesmeric Overreach. He drew on the writings of Benjamin Rush to argue that early medical reformers had overestimated the mind's obedience to command. Among his footnotes appeared a brief remark: "The Philadelphia hypnotist remains a warning that conscience, once divided, may develop a will of its own." The paper circulated quietly among students, but was withdrawn from publication after one reviewer complained of unsettling phrasing. A decade after Mallory's disappearance, the myth had taken firm root. Some told it as moral allegory. Others insisted it was pure fact. In barbershops, men joked that if you stared too long at your reflection while shaving, it might blink first. A laundress claimed she'd seen a pale man's face in the wash water, though no one stood behind her. A constable investigating the report found nothing, only the basin overturned and the woman shaking, repeating, "He knows my name." Meanwhile, Philadelphia's institutions of learning were entering a new age of psychiatry and neurology. The Mallory case, stripped of its superstition, survived in lecture halls as a footnote, a forgotten practitioner whose experiments anticipated the dangers of autosuggestion. Yet even the most skeptical professors avoided mentioning the specific address. It was said that anyone who researched too deeply into his methods soon developed the same fixation, seeing mirrored faces in quiet rooms, hearing the tick of a stopped watch in their dreams. One student who assisted Burke later confessed that during late-night study, his own reflection had smiled before he did. By the close of 1906, the Pine Street lot was once again listed for demolition. But the order, like the others before, was postponed for budgetary reasons. To this day, no record confirms that the foundation was ever cleared, only that the city stopped listing the number entirely, as if striking a line through a name best left unread. By 1907, that narrow omission on Pine Street maps had become a neighborhood superstition. Children chalked a single blank square on their sidewalk games where the missing number should have been. Older residents said the city left it that way to keep the silence undisturbed. But silence is never perfect. That spring, a small-time photographer, Daniel Greaves, purchased a second-hand camera from a pawn shop on Market Street. The shopkeeper claimed it had belonged to a watchmaker who died years earlier, Elias Dorr, the same man whose notes had ended with, "He wanted to know the time." Greaves loaded a plate and decided to test it in the Pine Street district. When he developed the glass the next evening, the exposure showed not an empty lot, but the faint outline of a townhouse facade, its windows bright as mirrors, a figure standing within one frame. Greaves destroyed the plate and swore off photography, taking work instead as a streetcar conductor. His journal entry for that date ends: "There was no man there when I took it." Around this time, a visiting lecturer from Boston, Dr. Walter Fain, wrote a paper titled Residual Trance Phenomena in Post-Hypnotic Subjects. He referenced a case in Philadelphia where suggestion outlived the suggester. Fain speculated that the patient's own reflection might act as a secondary operator once the original hypnotist had vanished, a notion that made his peers uneasy. He mentioned Benjamin Rush only briefly, noting that the physician's theories on conscience as a physical faculty had inspired dangerous literalists. Privately, Fain told colleagues he intended to inspect the old records himself. 2 months later, while staying at a boarding house near Walnut Street, he disappeared. His room contained his papers and a single cracked hand mirror, the silvering peeled away except at the edges. The constable who examined it said the remaining metal showed a faint breathmark that would not fade. By autumn, rumor replaced report. Street preachers began telling the story of the doctor who took away guilt and lost his soul. They said his spirit wandered reflections, seeking a new host. Superstition grew so thick that glaziers repairing nearby buildings were asked to cover new panes with newspaper until nightfall, lest the glass invite something through. One night a stonemason working late swore he heard tapping from the window behind him, slow, deliberate, like knuckles on the other side. When he turned, The pane bore the mist of a breath and 3 clear words written in it: "Don't look back." City officials finally fenced the lot once more, calling it unsafe for pedestrian traffic. The sign they posted read, "No trespassing, condemned ground." By morning it had fallen, the nails sheared clean as though pulled from within. A patrolman replaced it, only to find his reflection in a nearby storefront glass, staring a fraction slower than he moved. He left the force within the year. By the dawn of 1908, the block seemed ordinary again under daylight, but at dusk the lamplight never quite reached the pavement there. Residents said the air bent around it, dimmer by a shade, and sometimes, if one paused at the corner when all else was still, one could hear the faint click of a watch winding itself somewhere very close, and the soft breath of someone counting the seconds. In the early spring of 1908, the Pine Street district tried to reclaim its forgotten space once more. City planners proposed a small garden where the condemned lot stood, a gesture of renewal. The work began without ceremony. 2 gardeners, a supervisor, and a few boys hired to clear debris. They turned the soil only a few inches before their spades struck something hard. Beneath a thin layer of earth lay fragments of mirror glass, curved as if once forming a circle. The workers gathered the pieces, wrapping them in burlap, but one of the boys later told his mother that as he lifted a shard toward the light, his reflection blinked while his eyes were still open. The project ended by sundown. The following week, the proposal was withdrawn. The paperwork marked simply public objection. That summer, a newly formed Society for Psychical Studies in Philadelphia held an evening discussion on unresolved local phenomena. The Mallory case resurfaced briefly, introduced by a nervous clerk who had once assisted Professor Burke. He read aloud from old notes describing a residue of will left imprinted upon glass. A few attendees chuckled until he produced a single surviving page from Mallory's notebook, its ink brown with age. The subject does not resist if the reflection commands first. The meeting ended abruptly when the clerk fainted, striking his head on the table. He recovered, but claimed afterward that he heard someone counting backward just before he fell. By autumn, quiet returned. The lot grew wild with ivy and grass. Children were warned away, though a few sneaked in to play among the stones. One child, 8-year-old Samuel Greer, the son of the former photographer, went missing one evening after sunset. He was found hours later, unharmed but dazed, sitting beside the lot's center where a small pool of rainwater had gathered. When asked what he had been doing, he replied, "Talking to the doctor." He described a man with a long coat and shiny eyes who asked him if he knew the day. When his mother pressed him further, he wept and said the man had walked away into the water. The report reached the local papers, but was printed only as a 2-line notice under miscellaneous happenings. Yet the district police quietly assigned a patrol at the corner for several weeks. One of the officers later remarked that at midnight, the puddles on the ground seemed to ripple without wind, as if stirred by a pulse. The following year, a theology student from St. Charles Seminary published an essay arguing that the legend of Mallory was a modern parable of conscience unconfessed. He proposed that the doctor's experiments were not sorcery, but the final symptom of an age convinced it could reason with sin. His closing line read, "In every glass we meet our own accuser." The essay won a local prize, but was later withdrawn from circulation when readers complained of sleeplessness and nausea after reading it aloud. By 1909, the Pine Street lot was again silent, but its story had grown into a city's private superstition. No one mentioned Mallory by name anymore. Instead, they spoke vaguely of the house where the mirror broke. And when conversation turned to conscience, someone always muttered, half jesting, "Don't let the reflection learn you." By the winter of 1909, the Pine Street lot had become a hollow among new buildings, a narrow void left unbuilt. Snow gathered there untouched, drifting in clean layers, but never showing footprints. A new constable assigned to the ward, Officer Raymond Lott, noted in his patrol log that frost forms on the inner side of the fence. He thought it curious, but not alarming, until one February night when he found the gate ajar. Inside lay the faint impression of a man's shoe, pressed into snow that should have melted from the day's warmth. Lot followed the prints halfway across the lot, where they stopped abruptly beside a shallow puddle of ice. There, his lantern flickered. In the brief shimmer before it died, he saw his own reflection on the ice surface smiling back at him, though his mouth had not moved. He left the job within a week, claiming ill health. The following spring, 1910, brought new interest from a group of university students compiling oral histories of the city's lesser-known legends. They interviewed older residents, transcribing their recollections. One name surfaced repeatedly: Dr. Mallory, the man who looked too long. An elderly woman named Mrs. Halpern, who had lived on the block since her youth, recalled hearing whispers through her wall in 1895. When asked to repeat what she heard, she leaned forward and said, "It wasn't words, dear. It was someone remembering out loud." The students dismissed it as metaphor, yet each later confessed unease during playback of the phonograph recordings. The wax cylinders carried faint ticks between her sentences, rhythmic, mechanical, like a clock's heartbeat. Meanwhile, the Society for Psychical Studies attempted a final investigation. Its secretary, Henry Collis, proposed to excavate the site under the guise of sewer inspection. He received quiet approval from a sympathetic councilman and began in late May. After 2 nights of digging, his team uncovered what appeared to be a section of the old cellar wall still intact, its bricks blackened but firm. Embedded between them was a fragment of polished glass, convex and unbroken. Collis lifted it with gloved hands, remarking that it was warm as breath. Within an hour, his assistant claimed to see movement within the fragment, shadows shifting, though no reflection should exist. The men left at dawn, locking their tools behind the fence. 2 days later, Collis failed to appear at the Society's meeting. A constable sent to his apartment found the door barred from within. When finally opened, the room was dark except for a single mirror resting on the floor. Collis sat before it, upright but lifeless, eyes open and fixed on the glass. The coroner recorded apoplexy induced by shock. The mirror was taken as evidence, but later disappeared from the station's inventory. Word spread quietly through the academic community. Professors advised their students to leave the old cases be. The last surviving photograph of the Pine Street property, taken months before its demolition, shows a narrow lot filled with weeds. Yet if one looks closely, historians later claimed, there is a faint shape in the window of the building next door, the outline of a man in a long coat, head slightly turned as if about to speak. By 1911, the Pine Street property was little more than a fence scar between 2 modest buildings. City planners, eager to erase reminders of its history, approved its final demolition. Work began in early May. Witnesses said the day was bright, the air unusually still. The crew dismantled the fence first, then began turning over the soil. The foreman, Patrick Grieve, recorded that his men unearthed old masonry and glass fragments, no hazard. At noon, one worker, Thomas Keir, struck something metallic with his spade. He bent to retrieve it, a small, rusted watch case, and laughed that the doctor's timepieces come up for air. He pried it open. Within seconds, he collapsed, seizing. The others carried him out into the street, but he never woke. The watch's hands, several witnesses noted, began to move again, though there was no winding key. The coroner listed natural causes: epileptic fit. The men refused to return to work that afternoon. The next morning, when they arrived, the watch was gone. Grieve later told the city engineer that the ground looked freshly smoothed, as if someone had finished for us in the night. The report ended there, unsigned. By late summer, the space was finally leveled. The city planted a few young elms to disguise the patch of newer earth, and for a time the street appeared healed. Children played near the corner again, and the stories receded into old men's talk. Yet those who lived in the adjoining houses spoke of small disturbances, the slow fogging of mirrors, whispers behind walls, the ticking of clocks that had stopped years before. A tailor on the block said his reflection sometimes turned its head before he did. When he mentioned it in the tavern, the barkeep crossed himself and said, "That's the doctor taking attendance." That autumn, a traveling lecturer from New York, Professor Gideon Marks, visited the university to present on the psychological residue of mesmeric practice. In passing, he referred to the Philadelphia hypnotist, linking Mallory's techniques to a broader pattern of 19th century overreach. He invoked Benjamin Rush, reminding his audience that every scientific reform carries the echo of its opposite. His closing remark silenced the room. If conscience can be removed, who decides what replaces it? Afterward, several attendees swore the gaslights dimmed for a moment, as if the room itself had drawn breath. By year's end, the Mallory affair had become a local ghost story told in gentle tones, but fragments still surfaced. In December, an old constable cleaning his attic found one of the small mirror shards once collected from the site, wrapped in yellowing newsprint. He tossed it into the hearth. The fire hissed, guttered, and then burned twice as bright. That night, he dreamed of a man seated across from him, murmuring, "You have my eyes now." He woke before dawn and refused ever after to light a fire indoors. The following spring, the Pine Street lot bloomed briefly, violets and wild grass where no seed had been sown. Neighbors found it beautiful, though one remarked the petals seemed to tilt toward their own reflections in puddles after rain, as though listening. By 1912, Philadelphia had nearly forgotten the precise address. The block was fully paved, its number reassigned. Shops lined the street now, an apothecary, a print seller, a cafe. Only those who had lived there longest remembered that one parcel of ground had refused to hold a house. They spoke of it softly, like a wound that aches in changing weather. The younger generation treated it as nonsense, though some still crossed to the other side after sunset. That spring, a photographer named Helen Voss was hired by the city to document historical streets. Her lens captured the newly built storefronts, bright and uniform, but when she developed the plate taken near the center of the block, one frame appeared darkened. In the image, the reflection in a shop window showed an older building, a narrow townhouse, high windows shuttered. At the upper pane, the faint suggestion of a face looked out. Voss, trained to notice detail, wrote in her notebook, "The exposure doubled itself, but the light disagrees." She turned the plate over to the archives, where it quietly vanished. In August, a minister from St. Luke's, Reverend Josiah Cray, visited the cafe now standing on the former lot. He had been a young curate when Mallory's name still stirred whispers, and he felt uneasy sitting there. He later told a parishioner that, when he bowed his head to pray, the mirror behind the counter showed him seated alone, his reflection not matching his folded hands. The next week, he gave a sermon on the dangers of seeing one's own forgiveness. It was not well attended. Later that year, an old manuscript surfaced at a private estate sale in Chestnut Hill. Bound in cracked leather, its title read, "Studies in Reflection, Private Notes of E. Mallory." The buyer, a lawyer named Winthrop Hale, kept it locked for several months before showing it to anyone. When he did, the ink had faded to near invisibility. Only one passage remained legible. "The reflection awakens when the mind grows still. It waits for permission." Hale sold the book to a collector in New York and refused to speak of it again. 2 years later, he was found collapsed before a darkened mirror in his home. His watch stopped at 12 minutes past 12. By now, even scholars referred to the affair only as the Philadelphia hypnotist incident. The journals of psychiatry and medicine had reclassified it as myth, an urban legend born from the public's fear of early hypnotic science. Yet, in the margins of one lecture series, an anonymous student scribbled a line still quoted decades later. "Science moves forward, but mirrors do not forget." The block changed hands repeatedly over the following decade. Each business that occupied the central address lasted scarcely a year before closing, owners citing unpleasant atmosphere or restless nights. A grocer who tried to renovate found that his front window clouded over every evening until he removed the glass entirely. Even then, passers-by claimed they could see faint outlines shifting on the polished counter inside. The new tenants hung curtains and pretended not to notice, By 1915, the last witnesses to the Mallory years had grown old. The Pine Street block no longer carried his name or his number, and yet each time the street was repaved, a faint hollow would form where the ground once held his house, a shallow dip that rainwater never filled. The city paved it again and again, but the depression returned, quiet as breathing. On foggy evenings, the cafe owners swore their mirrors misted from within. One waitress, polishing a glass, said she caught her reflection blinking slowly out of rhythm, as though two faces had learned the same gesture differently. She left her shift that night and never returned. That same autumn, a medical historian lecturing at the university revisited Benjamin Rush's legacy, describing the doctor's humane vision of mental care and the dangerous zeal it inspired in later disciples. He did not name Mallory, but paused halfway through his talk, staring at the polished case of his pocket watch, eyes unfocused. The transcript notes only that he ended the lecture early, murmuring, "The reflection teaches us." Students thought it a metaphor. By 1917, the last building on the original foundation was condemned for structural instability. The demolition crew arrived, skeptical of the story's remnants. Their foreman, younger than the legend itself, joked that perhaps the ground would whisper. When they struck the earth, the air turned colder, their breath visible though it was summer. Beneath the final layer of brick, they found nothing but a thin sheet of glass, buried flat, like a mirror laid face down. They broke it to remove it, and for a moment, one worker swore he heard a man exhale behind him. The sound never came again. After that day, Pine Street grew quiet. The lot was finally cleared, and a narrow alley now runs where the townhouse once stood, featureless, gray, and barely wide enough for a man to pass. Locals say it feels cooler there, even in July, and that if you stop halfway through, you can hear a soft ticking echoing off the walls, out of rhythm with your heartbeat. Some call it superstition, others memory. The police reports, the mirrors, the letters, all gone in fire or dust. Only stories remain. Old residents sometimes claim that, on rare nights when the gaslight falters, the shape of a man can be seen reflected in the cafe's window, his expression calm but searching, as though still asking permission to speak. They say he looks not at the street, but at whoever stops to stare too long. And then, when the watcher moves away, their own reflection lags for just a second before catching up, eyes glinting, lips parting, as though about to whisper their name. Even now, a century later, the wind in that narrow space carries an uneven rhythm, soft and measured, like breath against glass. And some who pass through swear they can feel a faint pull at their gaze, a hesitation at the edge of sight, as if somewhere beneath the surface the doctor's experiment has never quite ended, and the reflection is still learning.